Hello, good evening. Welcome to my channel. I'm doing something new. I'm live streaming. And I apologize because the lighting in this room is terrible. This is a lot darker than I was expecting. But you can see me all right, can't you? I tried to light some candles to make it brighter. I'm sorry, my room is just too dark and gloomy and ambient. I feel like I'm live streaming in 2004 or something with this lighting. I suppose it is appropriate. Thank you. So welcome to the Vampire Book Club. And I know not all of you are in the book club, but this is a book club for you to listen to if you want to hear about vampire books. You don't have to be in the book club to listen to us talk about the vampire books. I'm thinking of this stream as sort of an extension of the vampire vlogs I used to do, where I would go see a movie and then just film an unscripted vlog and talk about it to the camera and put it up. But instead of movies, we're talking about books and we're doing it live. So you can ask me questions and tell me your thoughts on the book if you did read it, and I can talk to you and we can actually have kind of a conversation. How do you join the book club? You join my Discord server. There is a link in the description of this video. And when you join the Discord server, be sure to mention that you want to join the book club because it's private on the Discord server, and then I will add you to it. And anyone who joins during this stream, I will get to you and add you to that afterwards. I'm just reading the chat right now. Yes, you are all correct. I'm caught up on the chat. Oh, you just saw the Lost in Adaptation video about Lestat, and it was great. Yes, it is great. Thank you. I worked with the Dom on his channel to help him summarize the Vampire Lestat because he's going to analyze the Queen of the Damned movie, and that's kind of the first step. And he thanked me in that and gave me props, which was great. So I enjoyed working on that with him. If you like vampire books, go watch his video on the Vampire Lestat. I will link you to that later if you want it. I do not have a Reddit account. So this month, for the Vampire Book Club, we read The Quick by Lauren Owen, a novel. And I gave the book club a choice to choose between 3 novels. The choice was The Quick, Fever Dream by George R.R. Martin, or Certain Dark Things. And the problem with Certain Dark Things is that it's out of print. So we decided not to read that, and I let the club vote. There's currently about 60 members in the club, and they voted and they chose The Quick. And The Quick is a Gothic Victorian pastiche novel. It's not authentically Gothic. It was written in, well, it was published in 2014, but it is in a very Gothic style. It almost has a Dickensian feel. So if you like reading Dickens and those kind of books, you would probably like the style of this book. But it is not written in a very modern style at all. So it might be off-putting to you if you're used to more modern style books. Anytime I go quiet like this, I'm just reading the chat. All right, so if you're not in the book club, which I'm assuming most of you are not because there's only about 60 people in the book club so far, I'm going to read you the summary, and then I will tell you about the book. I'll tell you my thoughts on the book. I will tell you the club's thoughts on the book. And if anyone in the club is in the chat and they want to share their thoughts, I will share those with you as well. (1892), James Norbury, a shy would-be poet newly down from Oxford, finds lodging with a charming young aristocrat. Through his new friendship, he is introduced to the drawing rooms of high society and finds love in an unexpected quarter. Then suddenly, he vanishes without a trace. It says suddenly, but he vanishes around page 200, so it's not very suddenly at all. Alarmed, his sister, Charlotte, sets out from their crumbling country estate, determined to find him. Within the sinister labyrinthine London that greets her, she uncovers a hidden supernatural city populated by unforgettable characters: a female rope walker turned vigilante, a street urchin with a deadly secret. That deadly secret is vampires, and the chilling Dr. Knife. But the answer to her brother's disappearance ultimately lies within the doors of the exclusive secret Aeolus Club, whose predatory members include the most ambitious and most bloodthirsty men in England. In her first novel, Lauren Owen has created a fantastical world that is both beguiling and terrifying. The Quick will establish her as one of fiction's most dazzling talents. And you can tell by looking at the book and on the internet about this book that they really believe that she would be established as one of fiction's most dazzling talent. There are tons of blurbs on this book, on the Amazon page for the book, on any place where you look up that you would try to find anything about this book. Tons of blurbs about her. They really hyped up this book. It got a lot of press. Hold on, catching up on the chat. Oh my goodness, have to hide some trolls from the chat. All right, so you notice that the description of this book doesn't mention vampires at all. And none of the marketing for this book mentioned vampires either. There is no mention of vampires whatsoever. And I had been aware of this book for a long time as a Gothic novel, and I love Gothic novels. Anything that has to do with that kind of atmosphere, I love. So I was aware of this book, but I never knew it was a vampire book until one of my followers sent it to me, sent it to my P.O. box and told me it was a vampire book, and surprise. So it was something that I was excited to read. So I'm glad that the book club chose it for their first book to read. And there's a lot of Victorian Gothic pastiche in this book that's sort of directly homaging existing stories. Like the whole beginning section is about Charlotte and James when they're children, and it's supposed to be an homage to Turn of the Screw. And it has a lot of Secret Garden in it too. Any of those children's Victorian Gothic stories that have to do with a mansion that's falling apart, secret passageways, secret hideaways in a mansion. And these two children are growing up in it with their absentee father, who then dies in a horribly Gothic way. And the girl stays behind at the mansion, and the boy, James, goes off to school because that's what you did in Victorian times. And he goes off to Oxford and then graduates and then decides he doesn't know what to do with his life. Maybe he wants to be a writer. He's not sure. He decides to try it, but he needs a roommate. So he moves in with Christopher Page, who is this incredibly charming society boy, almost like a frat boys kind of style guy, who's always out partying, and they're complete opposites, yet they have this kind of witty repartee dynamic going on. They never really dislike each other, but you kind of get that they're not close. And then one of the big twists, spoilers, that comes in is they fall in love. And all of a sudden, we are in a queer love story, which is so sweet and so touching. And I was so into their relationship. And from what we were talking about in the club chat in the Discord, a lot of people were into it too. Did you guys like that aspect of it or dislike it? Pause for the chat's response. So you guys are talking about the changes in perspective. The first section being from the children's point of view. It was kind of mostly Charlotte's perspective. It was omniscient, but it was mostly in Charlotte's point of view. And then we go into James's point of view. And from the way I'd read the description, not this description, but there's another description that I'd read, made it sound like Charlotte was the protagonist of the book and that it would be her trying to find her brother, that her brother would disappear and then she'd try to find him. And she doesn't really show up as an adult doing anything until page 200. And then most of the time, stuff is happening to her. She does become active later. She's not a passive character, but she didn't really feel like the protagonist of the novel. And to a modern reader, that can be very off-putting. If you're used to reading books that were written almost, 150 years ago, then this would feel natural that you have all these multiple point of view characters. And they aren't the only 2 point of view characters. There's like 3 others that come in as well. So if you're on board with that, it's okay. But I'm not surprised that a lot of people didn't like the way it switched point of views that way. So what happens with James and his boyfriend and their adorably sweet relationship is that they get attacked by a vampire. Surprise! And there has been nothing in the book about vampires up to that point at all. As far as we know, it's just regular old-timey London. Supernatural things don't exist in this world. We know that Christopher's brother has been acting weird, but we think maybe he's sick or maybe he's in some kind of like conspiracy, like an Illuminati kind of thing going on. But no, it's vampires. And this Aeolus Club, which I'm probably mispronouncing that, I looked up some information on the author of this book, and she pronounced it, but she has a very thick accent, so I had trouble pronouncing it. The members of this club, which is one of those old-timey British clubs where they sit around and smoke cigars and women aren't allowed, they're all vampires. So, cool club. I'd like to join, but they wouldn't have me. So the members of this club have decided they want to expand their numbers. And we find this out later. And originally, the only way you could become a vampire, as far as anybody ever knew, any vampires anybody knew, any vampire hunters, any vampire scholars, they all thought you had to be willing to become a vampire. So we find out later that they have just discovered, oh, you don't have to be willing at all. You just have to do it. And anyone can become a vampire. That was a superstition that nobody needed. So they decide to expand their numbers by going out and getting unwilling people. And one of them is super into Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde is briefly in this book. He makes kind of a cameo appearance. And James and Christopher are about to run away together because their families are like, you're too gay. You have to stop being so gay. So they're going to run away together. But before they run away together, they swing by Oscar Wilde's house. And the vampire who's there to attack Oscar Wilde thinks James is Oscar Wilde because he's a writer, he's a playwright, just like him. And he attacks James and kills Christopher. And it is the most tragic, sad. I was in such denial when I read it. I was like, nah, Christopher's not dead. He's just hurt. And then James is kidnapped by this vampire. And no, he's gone. It was so sad. I don't think I've forgiven this book for that. But, it's important when a book makes you feel things. So James gets kidnapped by this club, gets turned into a vampire, and that's his big disappearance. And right when that happens, before we find out whether Christopher's really dead or not, before we find out what exactly has happened to James other than a vampire bit him, it changes points of view. And all of a sudden, we have a brand new character's point of view. And this brand new character, his name is Mold. And it's not spelled like moldy mold, but he's Mold. And he is kind of a servant of a vampire. And his job for the vampire is to study vampires. And so now we're reading his diary of his decades of studying vampires. And it goes back to how he got started studying vampires and how he got all his progress of studying vampires. And I kept I wasn't sure exactly what year the beginning was, so I kept waiting for it to catch up and be like, oh, maybe this is the part. Nope, we still got another 10 years to go of reading about this guy's vampire studies. Yes, it was the bury your gaze trope. Poor Christopher. And I guess James too, because he undies. Both gay characters die. Very sad. I like that we had a gay romance in here. I don't like that they died. It would have been okay to kill some gay characters if you had more gay characters. Maybe like if some of the other characters have been gay, but most of the other characters didn't have any hint to their romantic inclinations, so we can only guess what their sexuality was. But yeah, so now we got 100 pages with Mold and his vampire studies. And I'm reading this and I'm like, yes, this is good information. I'm learning about how the vampires work. I'm learning about how they function in society and all this backstory, which I've already filled you all in on. But what about James and Christopher? That's all I cared about. That's what my, as a reader, that's what I've been invested in so far. So it was frustrating, but it was also effective. I feel like that's what the author wanted. The author wanted to devastate you, because authors are cruel and evil, I should know. Definitely devastated me, and now we're with this moldy old guy. And we learn all about what is the book's reread value, since you didn't like how Christopher died. I'll get to that. I learn all about how the vampires work, and then interjected into this towards the end of Mold's diary, we start getting hints of what's up with James. We see him in the place where he's kidnapped. We see him turning into a vampire, and then eventually he sort of comes out of this sickness that he's in. He's fully turned, and he wakes up, and he's finally able to move around, and he realizes that he's being held captive in this club, which is kind of like a big house, and he's in an attic, and there's someone held captive in the room next to him, and it's a human who they also want to force to be a vampire, but he doesn't want to be a vampire, and his name is Howland, and he's an American, so he is all kinds of inappropriate, but, you know, charmingly so. So James and Howland escape, they run out, they're buddies, and then they part ways because James wants to eat everyone, and, you know, he doesn't want to actually do that, so he's resisting his vampire urges, and he goes home and tries to hide. Meanwhile, Charlotte, his sister, finally we get to her. She has grown up into her upper 20s, or how old she was, and she's been living in the crumbling old estate where they grew up with this terrible old aunt nursing her in her bitter health. The aunt dies. She sends word to James to tell him, hey, our aunt's dead. Come to the funeral. James doesn't reply. Telegram doesn't reply. So she's like, well, I guess I gotta go to London and find out what happened to James. And she gets there, goes to his apartment, and sees him, and he's a vampire, and he bites her. He like bites her wrist and then runs out, and she doesn't know what to think. She's scared. And then there's another vampire that comes at the door that's trying to hunt down James, but she doesn't invite him in. She gets away. She's running. And then all of a sudden, vampire hunters show up to save her. And these vampire hunters put her in a carriage and take her off to their vampire hunter house. So these two vampire hunters are Adelaide and Shetland, the other guy's name. Sheffield. Forgettable name. He is old enough to be her dad. And she is one of those fancy ladies who dresses like a boy. Because, you know, in Victorian London, you always have to have a lady who dresses like a boy. And she is a former circus performer, former tightrope walker. So she's very acrobatic and very skilled. How do humans kill vampires? Well, these vampire hunters don't actually try to kill the vampires. They don't think they really can. Shadwell, yes, that's his name. And I should know that because it reminded me of Good Omens. And mostly they try to help people that are being attacked by the vampires. They try to get them out of town. They try to rehabilitate them. They're like the vampire victim support network. And we learned that Adelaide used to be engaged to Shadwell's son. And then Shadwell's son got turned into a vampire, and they tried to save him. And that's how they became vampire hunters and vampire scholars. They failed saving him. They helped him commit suicide, assisted suicide. And then they decide to make their lives out of it. But everyone looks at their relationship and thinks, oh, it's so scandalous. This young lady who dresses like a boy living with this older man, they must be, romantic somehow, but not married. So scandalous. And, you want to give the book the benefit of the doubt and be like, well, we know they're not. We know it's just about, he's like a father to her. But no, there's a scene in there where he starts getting the hots for her, even though she's young enough to be his daughter. And she's like, oh, progressive and French. And she's like, well, if it's going to be that way, I guess I might as well go for it. And she goes and she kisses him. And she's like, all right, let's do this. You want to bang me? Let's just go. Let's just get the sexual tension over with. And he's like, the horror. I'm so British. I can't do this. I'm just going to keep it all bottled up forever. And no. And she's like, all right, fine. You're a loss. And so they have this weird sexually tense relationship from there on after, which I wasn't a fan of. Off topic, but did you show everyone your awesome onesie yet? I think you've all seen this onesie before. Off topic, this is my Haunted Mansion onesie. Isn't it pretty? Yes, Adelaide and Shadwell's moment of sexual tension was really weird. And then I thought, well, maybe this is a good thing because the author went there, but then she dealt with it and now it's done. So we don't have like years of sexual tension. It's just done, but it wasn't really done. Like it kept coming back. And even in the end, it was still kind of there. And I was just like, I was not a fan of that. Like, why can't people just have platonic relationships? Those are valid too. All right. So Charlotte's rescued by Adelaide and Shadwell, taken to their vampire hunter house. And then Howland shows up on their doorstep too, because Howland has been trying to deal with the fact that he was almost turned into a vampire and he's American and he was a tourist and now he has nowhere to go. And these vampires are chasing him, so no one else wants to help him. So he turns up there. And the four of them kind of sort of plan together what they're going to do. Charlotte really wants to rescue James, but she doesn't know what's happened to him. Meanwhile, James gets re-abducted by the vampires. They catch him. But while all this is going on, we have yet another set of characters who are the typical Dickensian street urchin characters, because you always got to have those. There is a young vampire named Liza, who is our other point of view character, and she's several decades old as a vampire, but she looks like she's like, 8 or 9 or something. She's very, very small, very cockney. And there's 2 sets of vampires in the city, we learn. There's the club vampires who are all men, all high society, all very stuck up and supremacist and stuff. And then there's the street vampires, which are all mix of ages and genders and everyone. And their leader is Miss Price. And Miss Price is an older vampire. She's very tough. There's a scene where the club had captured her in the past and she kicked their asses and got away because she's just that canny. And Miss Price is kind of the unofficial leader of the street vampires. And Liza is her favorite urchin of her collection of urchins because, got to collect urchins in Dickensian London. It's what you do. So Liza sort of exists to give us points of view. She runs into James at one point, so we get that from her point of view. She runs into some other vampires and find out more about the intrigue that's going on. The character over here, who is mentioned, Dr. Knife, that is Mold. So all the street vampires live in fear of Dr. Knife because part of his experiments for the vampire he works for, the club vampire he works for, was to figure out how vampires work because vampires never knew what their true limits were, their true weaknesses. So Dr. Knife, Mr. Mold, would go out and catch a street vampire and then kind of vivisect it and experiment on it and then dispose of it. He's that kind of awful doctor scientist. He's not actually a doctor. He never went to medical school. He doesn't have a degree. He's just an experimentalist. And we also learn that the guy who hired him, who was just a random vampire in the club, is planning a coup, and he took over the club at one point. So now he's in charge of the club, and he killed off the old supreme leader, whatever. And so now he's the one that wants to expand the club's numbers back now that they realize they can turn people without their permission, he thinks that's a good way to expand the club's numbers. So far, it's not going so great. James didn't work out. Howland didn't work out. So Howland and Charlotte, teaming up with the two vampire hunters, trying to make a plan to rescue James. They say, the vampire hunters tell them, well, we have a friend who is a vampire, but he's a good vampire. He doesn't belong to either factions. He's a lone wolf vampire, and he won't hurt us, and he will help us because he knows everything that's going on in this city. He's like, he's got his fingers in all the pies, but he's neutral territory. So they go to this vampire's house, and they realize that the way this vampire keeps himself in control, keeps himself from attacking them, is he has chosen to remove his arms and legs. And he exists just as a trunk and a head with a human nursemaid to take care of him, who will carry him around and, clean up after him and feed him and stuff, because these vampires eat food. And this vampire tells them that, if you want to stop the club, then you got to team up with the street vampires, and maybe you can do it this way, maybe you can do it that way, but he doesn't really help them much, even though he's been their friend for years. But in repayment for what little help he gives, Shadwell has to give him some of his blood. So the only way you can repay a vampire favor is by giving your blood. So they go to the street vampires then, at this guy's suggestion, and say, will you help us? Will you help us attack the club to get Charlotte's brother back and to stop them from doing this thing? We have proof that they're turning people without permission now. This is a big deal. And the street vampires say, no, not our business. We're not getting involved. We don't even really believe you. They can read minds, so they do believe you, but they don't decide it's not that important. So then we have a scene where Liza's bringing a message to the neutral vampire. And when she gets there, he's dead. And Shadwell's there. And Shadwell's like, I came in here and I found him dead. And what are we going to do? It must have been the club that killed him. Take a message back to Miss Price and see if she'll change her mind about attacking the club now. And Liza's like, I can't read, but sure. And so she does that. And then we find out immediately after that was actually Shadwell that killed him. And Shadwell did it for the sake of making the street vampires think the club vampires did it. And oh, such a shocking action. And Adelaide is not pleased, but Charlotte and Howland have no clue about all this. Oh, someone says, wasn't Christopher's brother always at the club? Yes, Christopher's brother, Eustace, which is a wonderful name for a villainous character. Eustace is at the club. He's been turned into a vampire. And when he found out that Christopher was turned, the vampire that turned Christopher, they became enemies. And so when James has been recaptured, they say, well, James, clearly this experiment's failed. We want to, we'll do some experiments on James. Dr. Knife can vivisect him or whatever, and then we'll have him killed. But the vampire that turned James, his name is Michael, he comes down to the basement where James is being kept. And okay, I'll get back to that. And James manages to kill Michael, which makes Michael's brother, the leader of the club, pissed off. So then the leader of the club, instead of just killing James, says, no, we have to make it last and string it out. So they don't kill James yet. They're going to string it out. And meanwhile, Eustace now feels good that James killed the guy who killed his brother Christopher, because Eustace used to hate James for being gay and for turning his brother gay, because of course it was James's fault. But now Eustace is like, well, James avenged my brother's death, so maybe he's okay. And they have this weird growth moment. That was cool. So the street vampires and the hunters and Charlotte and Howland, they all plan an attack. They're all going to go attack the club, maybe rescue James if they can, but probably not, because he's a vampire anyway, so what's the point? But then Charlotte and Howland are supposed to leave. They're supposed to get out of town because they're just puny humans. What can they do? So they're about to leave. And then they're on their way out of town. And then Charlotte's like, never mind, I'm going back. And Howland's like, well, if you're going back, I'm going back because I'm a gentleman and we have romantic tension. And the whole time I was reading this, I was just like, ugh, these guys are going to hook up, aren't they? Why does everyone have to get paired off romantically? So Charlotte and Howland go back to the vampire hunter house. But surprise, vampire hunters are dead. And then flashback scene, we find out that a bunch of club vampires showed up and attacked the vampire hunters, Adelaide and Shadwell, and killed them. And they killed all the vampires, so it was a fight to the death. And what was even the point of that? Like, they just got killed off for the sake of getting killed off. We don't even find out why the club vampires did it, like what instigated it. If it was Shadwell killing the neutral vampire, if they found out about that, they found out that he blamed them, but then they didn't seem to know the other guys were attacking. It was I was frustrated with that scene. I mean, I like that characters die. It's important to kill off characters sometime, but it seemed like there could have been more done with it. It seemed like a waste of it. And like right before they did die, they have this moment where they're like, let's almost kiss. And like, I think she did kiss him, and it was just like, well, they're gonna die. And this character, Adelaide, she was probably my favorite character in the whole book, because unlike Charlotte, she was actually active. She was a lot more sympathetic. She was a lot more interesting. She had more interactions with people. And yeah, she died. Some other people in the book club also said the same thing, that they liked Adelaide a lot better than Charlotte. So, yeah, they had an onion sign hanging outside the shop, and they said it was like an old reference to something. If there was significance to it, I missed it too. It's probably some inside joke if you're familiar with Victorian London tropes, which I'm not that familiar with. Maybe it's like Shrek. Onions have layers, just like vampires have layers. So the street vampires are still pissed off that their buddy died, so they're going to plan an attack. So now we're back in Liza's point of view, and Liza is going to like sneak in the roof. Well, Miss Price and her guys go in the front door. And meanwhile, Charlotte and Howland have, since their friends died, they decide to go rescue James and Sel, so they're trying to get in the attic. Meanwhile, Dr. Knife is trying to get there. So then we have the climax scene where it's this big fight scene between all the vampires in the club. The club gets set on fire. Everything explodes. Pretty much everyone dies. Liza gets away. Howland, Charlotte, and James get away. Eustace and Mold get away. The main leader vampire gets away too, Edmund. But Eustace helps James get away. But then we find out later that he immediately got killed for doing that. So Eustace had his redemption arc, and it was really sweet. I like that he helped James at the end, but then he just dies. So the leader of the club vampires and Mold have this scene afterwards that's like, Mold, I will finally give you what you always wanted. I will finally make you a vampire. You will become a vampire now, and there's something important you must do. Remember this, because it will not be important later whatsoever. That's our last scene with them. I'll get back to this. Liza escapes. She's the only street urchin to escape. Miss Price dies. We find out she gets like eaten by like the big brute, ugly vampire who also survives. So most of the street vampires are gone. Liza runs off and starts her own street gang of children vampires that live in the subways. And we get like 50 years of story for her to find out what she did for the rest of her eternity up to modern times. Charlotte and Helen and James get away, but James is a vampire. He's suffering. He wants to eat everybody. He can't deal with the bloodlust. There's nothing he can do to stop it. So they take James back to the crumbling country Gothic mansion. They hide him in the secret room that's behind a bookshelf in the library, where you pull a book off the shelf and hide him in there. And they're like, stay in there, we're going to find a cure. Even though the whole book they've been told there is no cure for vampires and there's nothing they can do. But Charlotte and Howland are like, we'll find a cure. Howland got shot in the leg. He loses his leg. So Charlotte has to nurse him back to health. They kind of fall into like this bond of, it's kind of like the end of the Hunger Games, where Peeta and Katniss are like, we're both too broken to be in love, but we're the only two people that's gone through what we've gone through, and no one else will ever understand our suffering, so we might as well get married and stay together. And it's better for you to be married to me because you're a lady in Victorian times, and what else are you going to do? And I'm rich, so I can help you. So they have this romanceless marriage, and they decide they're going to travel the world and find a cure. So they travel the world for years. And this is like the last, this much of the book. Now they're traveling the world. In their travels, they see Mold as a vampire spying on them at one point. They see a couple of the other club vampires spying on them at one point. But those vampires never catch up to them. They never actually do anything. They're just kind of lurking. So we know they're still around. But that whole scene where Edmund was like, Mold, I will finally make you a vampire. There's something important you must do for me. Nothing ever happens. Adelaide said Shadwell's dead. Mrs. Price is dead. Liza's off living in the sewers. So we've got, another 50 pages of Charlotte and Howland traveling around in their romanceless marriage until they eventually decide, you know what? We are hot for each other. We do actually want to do it. And, 10 years down the line, they start being romantic and their marriage is complete. And next thing we know, Howland is like 90 years old and Charlotte is dying, and he's bringing her back from America where they've apparently been living. He's like, she will die in England, but then she dies on the crossing because she's old. So he gets back to England with her dead, and he's going to bury her. And he says, the last thing I have to do after 50 years of accomplishing nothing, doing all kinds of stuff, trying to find a cure for vampires, I have to go back to where we left James, in the hole, in the library, behind the bookshelf. They left him in this like sleeping state. Poor James, but apparently he was asleep and he wasn't suffering. So he goes back, he opens up the bookshelf, James is gone. The end. Yeah. So there was a scene earlier on where the nursemaid of the neutral vampire has this whole point of view section where she realizes that Shadwell was the one who killed her or killed him. And she's like, I know what I've got to do now. And my master left me money, and I'm going to get this money, and I'm going to do all this stuff. And I have a plan, and I'm going to do something. I know the secret. And then nothing happens. Maybe she's the one who went and told the club vampires that Shadwell killed Neutral Guy, and that's why the club vampires showed up and killed Shadwell and Adelaide, but we don't know that for sure. Nothing ever comes back to her. I don't know why she even had that point of view section. I don't know why Edmund and Mold had their point of view section where they said something was very important. And I don't know why we come back and James is gone. Until I went and I looked up some information about this author, because this is the only book she's ever written. She's published a short story, but other than that, this is the only book. This has been out for 6 years now. She doesn't have a social media presence. She doesn't have a website. She doesn't have anything, but I did find some old interviews with her. And she says that originally when she wrote this book, it was twice as thick. It was a huge book. And she wrote this giant book and then decided she was going to split it in half. The book went from Victorian times all the way to modern times. So when she split it in half, she decided to keep the more modern section for a separate book. And that's going to be a sequel. So I think all those dropped threads of if James disappeared from the priest hole, where did he go? How long was he gone? What was he doing that whole time? Was he out for 50 years, living his own life, having all these own adventures? Maybe that's going to be in the next book, and we're going to get his life story, because she wrapped up Liza. We saw exactly what happened to Liza over the 60, 70 years after. So I'm sure we're not going to see Liza in the sequel, but we're probably going to see James. We're probably going to see that nurse lady, and we're definitely going to see Edmund and Mold because they're doing something important. However, these interviews were from 2014 when this book was published, where she said she was working on that sequel, and there's been not a peep of it since. So I don't know if the sequel is still actually coming. Yeah, this book is 600 pages. This is a big, long book. And that's how much additional was left. So I don't know if the sequel is actually coming. Now that I know the book was written to set up for a sequel that was originally twice as long and she split it, that makes me a lot more generous towards it, makes me less disappointed. If I just thought it was a book by itself, it was standalone and that was it, I would have said, oh, I hate the way this book ends. Oh, so many missed opportunities, so many dropped threads. But you got to drop threads to leave some for the sequel. So now I understand. So I really hope the sequel is actually coming. If it does come, I would read it. I did love the style of this book because I do like Victorian Gothic novels. I liked the atmosphere. I liked that she didn't put all the information on the page. When Christopher and James were falling in love, she did it so subtly and in so few words that everything was between the lines. And I love that. I love that kind of stuff where these two characters are having just a completely normal conversation about nothing, but you can see them falling in love between the lines. And then all of a sudden they're kissing. And it's not like, oh, where did that come from? It's like, it's there. And the descriptions were kind of really spare, but really specific at the same time. So I think it is really well written for what it is. And the whole fiction's most dazzling talents, I get that. Very talented author. If this kind of thing is up your alley. If you like Dickens, you'll like this. If you like Dracula, you'll probably like this because of the multiple points of view and the different writing styles. Some people call this an epistolary novel. It is not. There is only one epistolary section. Most of it is third person, close point of view. There's a couple omniscient sections too. Excuse me while I drink my wine. This is my new favorite wine. It's called Cocoa Bon Roasted Oak. I bought it at Trader Joe's. Highly recommended. This is the most delicious wine that I've ever found at Trader Joe's. And it's only $7 a bottle. So, usually when I do vampire reviews, I talk about what the vampires mean, right? And what the vampires are metaphors for. And in that interview with the author, I found she said one thing she didn't like was when vampires were metaphors for sex. So she wanted to avoid that in this novel. And these vampires are very sexless. None of these vampires have romantic entanglements. They're all focused on increasing their numbers. They're focused on power. They're focused on drinking blood, of course. But they kind of lose the element of their humanity that is relationships. We see it with Christopher's brother. He kind of becomes this automatic person. He becomes very robotic. So these aren't sexy vampires in any way. They aren't sexual. And the kid, Liza, never matures past her childhood. And I made some notes. One thing she said that she wanted to explore with these vampires, which I thought was really interesting, with the relationships is, say you become a vampire, like Christopher's brother Eustace did. Can you tell your family the truth about what you've become? Or do you not tell them the truth to protect them? But if you don't tell your family the truth about being a vampire, is your love for your family complete? Can you have a complete relationship with someone while keeping a secret, like being a blood-drinking creature of the night? And another thing that I picked up on was just how dirty everything was in this novel. London was filthy. When Charlotte gets there, she's just like covered in gunk and mud. And even she's comparing it to the country where she comes from, where things are green and beautiful. But even where she comes from, her house is just caked in dust, crumbling and falling apart. Everything in this was deteriorating. It was just so filthy. And everything in London was just like covered in grime. And the vampire being this metaphor for this like filth that you can't remove. I thought that was really interesting too. Now I am looking at the chat because you guys have been saying a lot and I've been talking nonstop for like 40 minutes here. And I want to catch up on this chat. So I'm going to have a little bit of silence while I do this. And then I will address your questions. If you have new questions, post them now. If you posted a question earlier, but I missed it, post it again. about this book. Questions about things not about this book we'll talk about afterwards. All right? Steve George asks, can we assume that the author's skill with prose and world building overcame editorial reservations about issues with plot and character? I don't believe there would have been any editorial reservations with plot and character. I believe that a publisher would have been fine with these plots and characters. When it comes to splitting a big book in half, as long as it has an ending of some sort, if it's not a plot related ending, then it's an emotional related ending. A character has completed a full emotional arc. That's all you really need. And I think that this plot and these characters are quite, fine for the status quo of publishing. I don't think any editors would have had a problem with them. Not that I'm saying they shouldn't have. I'm just saying I don't think they did. Why are there so many children vampires? Is that explained? They are children because the street vampires are just turning children. There's this street where most of the vampires live called Salmon Street, and it's known as a dangerous street, and children are warned, don't go onto Salmon Street. You'll get mugged, you'll get sex trafficked, you'll get killed. Bad things will happen to you when you go on Salmon Street. But what really happens is the children get abducted by the vampires and turned into vampires. Most of the time, the vampires will just eat the children, not turn them. But if they, Miss Price or one of the other vampires, thought the child would be especially useful, because in Victorian London, if you're someone who's not in the upper class, having an army of street urchins can be quite useful. Sherlock Holmes made use of his army of street urchins, even though he didn't amass it, he just had it. It's a trope of the time to have your army of street urchins. Think Oliver Twist and Fagin. But the vampires turn the children deliberately to have child vampires to work for them. Augustus87 says the death has to serve a purpose, should not be to manipulate the reader, to motivate and change protagonists and carry them forward in their arc. Yes. And I don't think Adelaide and Shadwell's death motivated anyone. Charlotte and Helen were already coming back. They were already going to go and try to save James. They just now had to do it without their vampire hunter friends' help. So their death was probably just, well, these characters have served their purpose. Might as well kill them off now, because if they're in the climax, they'll be too useful and we have to make it harder for Charlotte. I think that's part of why their deaths was so frustrating. Eustace getting killed off after he helped James escape was sort of tragic poetic justice. That one was valid. Christopher getting killed off was very plot important. That one, I don't think, was just to manipulate the reader. It certainly had an effect on the reader. It gutted me, but that was the catalytic event for the entire story. Half the events that followed were because Christopher died. It was in the way his brother reacted. It was in the way the person who killed him reacted. It was in the way that the brother of that guy reacted when the person who killed him got punished for killing Christopher. It had a big impact. I don't think Christopher's death was manipulative. I think that was important. I think this was a story about what happened if Christopher died and James became a vampire. Nini L says, it sounds like the book would have been better if it ended with a fire. Yeah, if it ended with the fire and James and Charlotte and Howland riding off into the night and Charlotte being like, James, I will find you a cure. And the reader going, oh, Charlotte, honey, no, you won't, but good luck. I feel like that would have been a satisfying enough ending to next spend another like 60, 70 years with Charlotte and Howland just like fucking around Europe. That was kind of, it was a very long denouement. And I think a big part of that probably could have been saved for the sequel. I am really curious to read the sequel to find out why that was included in this book, not saved for later. Someone says, so not the Quick then, haha. Quick, the title, Quick is a synonym for alive. So the Quick are the humans. So the vampires call humans the Quick, kind of like Harry Potter wizards calling humans muggles. The Quick are the humans. I don't know why this book was called The Quick, because the humans, I guess it was about the humans, but it should have been called the vampires. The vampires were rarely ever referred to as vampires, which is another interesting thing. It wasn't just that the marketing for this book tried to hide vampires. Not so much because vampires were a twist, but because this book came out in 2014 during prime vampire fatigue, and I'm sure the marketing department publishing it was like, we don't want to let people know this is a vampire book. We like it and we want to publish it, but if they know it's a vampire book, they won't buy it. So we'll just market it as Victorian Gothic with supernatural elements, and the vampires will be a surprise. Which, you know, they're valid. I can see why they did that. And calling it The Quick, which, you know, who knows if that was the author's original title or not. A lot of authors don't get to keep their original titles and the marketing department decides it, but someone mentioned Lord of the Rings, that it was 1,000 pages, so Tolkien split it up into 3 books. And you know what? Her splitting this up into 2 books, I get it. I just want to know where that second book is. It's been 6 years. That's what I did with The Company of Death, which people have mentioned. That book I wrote, I split my book. It was also 1,000 pages. I split it up into 3 books. I rewrote it. So I didn't just like cut it into 3 and be like, here's the first third. I rewrote the first book entirely to make it feel more like a standalone novel. Yes, it does end on this to be continued feeling of like, well, now we're going to go save the world. But, you know, say there were no more books, you could assume, well, and then they did save the world. And, you know, it still has an emotional arc that you could be satisfied with if you make that assumption. But of course, you want to find out how they save the world. So that's what the next 2 books are about. So if she publishes the next book, and I understand it taking her 6 years to write the sequel, because for a book this dense and this stylized, it's going to be hard work, especially if this author has a day job. If, you know, you can't write full time when you only have 1 book out. You can't support yourself off that. She probably has a whole life going on, and it will come out eventually. And I just read it now, so I'm 6 years ahead of everyone who read it 6 years ago that are still waiting. Do I think the book would have been better if the author split into a trilogy, stopping the story at the climax during the battle at the Fire at the Club? That depends what's happening in the next book. I think that the next book is more focused on modern times, because she said it went up to modern times. So it's probably going to have a very different tone. It's not going to feel like a Victorian Gothic book like this one does. So she probably wanted to include everything in this book that matched that Victorian Gothic tone and the sojourn through Europe, chasing research and trying to find, you know, very Da Vinci Code kind of thing, but Victorian style. That is very styled to that 1800s feel, even though they keep doing it into modern times. So maybe the tone will be too different for that to have been included. And I don't know that there would be enough material beyond that last 50 pages to make a third book out of. It depends. Who knows? I'm sure she did what she thought was best for her own book. I can only assume she knows what's best for her book because most authors do. Someone asked if I could do a Q&A sometime soon. I just did a Q&A on my channel. Did you watch it? If I were to get enough questions, I would do another Q&A. Sorry, I'm off topic. We're still talking about the book. We can talk about me later. Eric Hursted asks, aside from Dracula being so important to modern vampires, why do you think that Victorians and vampires go together so well? Well, it's because the Victorian era, there was a big advance in technology. And that technology applied to communication and travel. And both of those things were exciting, but kind of scary too, to people that were very set in their ways, that had been doing things in a traditional way for hundreds of years. Now all of a sudden we have machines and lifestyles are changing, things are changing. And that fear of change and fear of the foreign, because all these technologies allowed communication with other places and travel to other places, so things were getting mixed up. That can feel very vampiric, and the vampire can represent those kind of fears. Oh, one other thing the author said about this book when she was talking about where did I put it in my notes? Oh, she said that she'd gotten that classic advice to write what you know and write what you're afraid of. And she said, write what you want. Write the book you want that no one else is writing. Write the book you want, and to write what you fear. And she said vampires encapsulate both desire and fear, because there's definitely a lot of desire, both on the vampires' part. The vampires have a lot of desire, even if they're not sex-focused vampires, but also people love vampires. People have loved vampires for decades and decades and decades, almost hundreds of years. But there's still that fear there. They're monsters. So that combination of desire and fear is a big part of what she worked into this book. And it fits with that Victorian theme because all that technological advancement, which is a big part of what Dracula is, with their obsession with like phonographs and typewriters and train schedules, that fits with that vampire fear of something that's interesting and exciting, but also scary. Sorry, the chat just jumped on me and I lost my place. So I may have missed some things. So are the vampires in the book like the Borg from Star Trek? You said they'd be very robot-like. They aren't hive-mindy like the Borg. They're just not human, They lose that element of interpersonal connection, where I think the Borg are like super connected. They're more robotic in that they lose that sense of like feelings. They're emotionally detached from things. but not hive mighty. They're all very individual. I'm not a complete English speaker. Can I read this in 19th century Victorian era English? It's not written with the language of Dickens. It's written with a modern style language. It's um I wouldn't say it's like super easy to read, but it's definitely doesn't feel like old fashioned English. It's modern style English. You can read it if you are familiar with modern style English. Anyone else find that James's narration got kind of flat after he changed? Not sure if that was intentional. He was going through a lot, but I hope he has more personality in the sequel if there is one. Well, I think James's style of narration changing had a lot to do with that vampire mentality. He was losing that part of his personality. And one thing that he's sort of freaking out about is, am I going to lose all of my humanity? Am I not going to be able to be a good person and do a good thing? So he tests himself and he makes himself sort of do good things. Like he tries to help someone, he tries to not do a bad thing that he could have done, and he says, "Oh yes, thank goodness, I still have that part of me. I'm not completely gone." But he doesn't know if he's going to get worse. He doesn't know if he's going to like a gradually turn into a totally different personality. I like that his narration style did change, even though it was less interesting to read. It reflected that vampire change too. The chat keeps jumping around on me. I'm sorry. Zach Hall mentions that this book was extremely white. The least English person is a French woman. That's correct. There were no people of color in this book that I noticed, unless something slipped by me, but it's set in 1890s London where there were plenty of people of color living, but none of them made it into this book. Prince Crazy asks, am I the only one who thinks that vampires should be born and not turned? Has that ever been explored in fiction? Yes, quite a bit. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is Blade, because there's a whole big faction thing between the bitten, not born thing. I've also just started watching the anime Vampire Knight, which is on Netflix. I just started it yesterday and I'm like 5 episodes in. It's very trashy. It is very anime. But it has a lot of my favorite vampire tropes. And they have a whole thing about born vampires versus humans turned into vampires and that whole class system. And that's interesting, given how trashy this anime is. Also, Fledgling was about born vampires. All those vampires were born. That was more of like a kind of pseudo sci-fi, like vampires are a different species than humans, but they've been also eugenicsed it's a bit because they're trying to breed vampires with darker skin to be sun resistant. There's a lot of born versus turned vampires. Getting off topic from this book, but I thought that was an interesting question, so I wanted to make sure I answered it. Oh, Alyssa Goss says, thinking of short stories, maybe we could read some vampire short stories. Do you mean for the book club? If so, possibly. Maybe we can read an anthology. There are a bunch out there, and I have a bunch on my shelf. But one thing that I want to tell all of you is that during this quarantine time, it's been very hard for me to write anything, fiction or vampire reviews scripts, because I am homeschooling my fledgling spawn. So I'm looking for some unscripted content to do. This live stream is kind of part of that, but I was going to do this anyway. But one thing that people asked me to do would be to read you vampire stories on my channel, in my usual setup with actual good lighting for one time. And I was going to start by reading The Vampire by Polidori, which I will read aloud, but also give my thoughts on as I'm reading it, hopefully in an amusing way, because there's a lot to sort of poke fun at in that story. So it won't be like listening to an audiobook. It'll be like experiencing it with me, which I think will be interesting. And I'll give it a shot, and if people like it, I'll do more. But just to have a video up in April when I'm not able to write anything, vampire stories. King of Quiche asks, do you feel like that now that you've written a book and have an inside perspective into the publishing world, it's easier to give the author the benefit of the doubt? Absolutely. It is so much easier to give the author the benefit of the doubt because, I feel that feel. I used to review books on my Goodreads account. I use Goodreads religiously for tracking my books, but I'm not that great of a reviewer there. But I would give them stars and sort of give some thoughts. And now I will either give a book 5 stars or no stars, because I know how hard it is to produce something that you love. And they say, write the book you want to see in the world. Maybe I didn't like reading that book that you wanted to see in the world, but I'm not going to try to bring it down in any way whatsoever now that I'm one of you, the authors. So trying to get into the author's head, which is what I do in vampire reviews anyway, because authorial intent is very interesting to me when it comes to analyzing vampire stories. Because it's either interesting to see how well it worked or how well it didn't, but to know where the author or the screenwriter or the director of a movie was coming from, I always want to know. So even with movies now, even like, unless it's a complete studio film that I was like, this was made by a studio, focus grouped, it was no one's vision, no one's passion project, then I usually will try to give the creator benefit of the doubt. Would I say The Quick has elements of personal horror, a la The Vampire the Masquerade? I would say for James, yes. He has that whole transformation sequence where he's turning and terrified of losing himself. There wasn't a lot of it. Liza didn't have much of it. She just kind of went along with it. But James definitely had a bit of that going on. Zach Hall says, I thought the vampire's visceral disgust at the thoughts of mortals was interesting. It was very classist in a way I hope is intentional. Yes, I did not mention that. So the vampires in this book are instantly adverse to humans. Humans are disgusting to them. They're like, if you went into a very badly kept pigsty and just like the pigs are gross and covered in filth, so that as soon as you become a vampire, you just don't want to be around the humans, because not only can you hear their thoughts, and all these humans are thinking horrible, cynical, negative, vile thoughts, because all humans do is think shit about each other all the time, but they smell bad, they look bad, and I don't know if this is just part of that gritty, dirty London of this book and how filthy everything is, and if it would be different for the vampires if they went out of town. But they just didn't want to be around humans at all, and just this repulsion. They wanted to eat them. The blood smelled good. They wanted to be with the blood, but they didn't want the humans' company at all. They didn't want to be with anyone. And I think that detachment, that being taken out of humanity, was part of what separated the vampire from the human in this, what vampires are in this world. But you're right, it also was classist. And there was definitely a lot of class conversation in this book. You had the Aegiolius Club, which were all a bunch of aristocratic wannabe snobs. Most of them weren't in the peerage, but they wish they were. And then you have the street vampires, which are all urchins, filthy gutter people, and they weren't that different at all. And you kind of sympathize with the street vampires a lot more. They were a lot more likable. They were a lot more interesting than the club vampires. You didn't like the club vampires at all. There was no one there to like. But in the end, in the battle, in the fire, they all die. And you kind of think, oh no, I was hoping the street vampires would win and beat the club. But wait, they're not that great either. Maybe it is best for London that all the vampires die. Wait, why am I trying to root for one of the vampires? Yeah, they all should have died. Good, they're all gone. No more vampires in London except the few stragglers, huh? But the street vampires were disgusting as well. They were all these terrible people that treated each other horribly, that fought all the time, that there was very little love between them. Miss Price, the affection she had for Liza was endearing, but other than she mostly treated her like an employee. So it was interesting. I like that take on vampires, because usually you see them being kind of enamored by humans, and this was the opposite. Steve George asks, if I could get in touch with the author, would you consider seeking them out for an interview on the channel? Oh, I'd love that. I mean, she lives in England, so it would have to be a remote interview. I've interviewed a couple authors on my channel. I do prefer to do it in person. But I'd love to pick this author's brain. She definitely has a passion for vampires. She's definitely very knowledgeable in literature. She, I think her degree from Oxford was in literature or something along those lines. Very smart lady. And the few little interviews I saw of her online were very interesting too. I just don't think she's into this right now, as far as I know. And, who's to say she'd be interested in me? I'm not anyone interesting. Sarah Adams says, I also found it interesting that the vampires in this book couldn't really be creative. James completely lost interest in his poetry. Yeah, he burns his play. He thinks everything he ever wrote was terrible. None of the vampires in the club do anything. They just kind of sit around. They don't have passions. They don't have projects. And the street vampires are just kind of about survival. These vampires are always cold. They're constantly cold. They just want to be around fire all the time. They can never get warm enough, so they just want to be warm. But I think that element of creativity is another humanity thing. What does it mean to be human? It means to have relationships. It means to be creative, those kind of things. And those are what the vampires lose. But the interesting thing is it doesn't make the vampires more like animals. It makes them more like robots or statues. They just kind of lose that whole personality. Can we look forward to a review of Vampire Night? Well, depends how much I have to say about it when I finish watching it. I'm only 5 episodes in, but if I have something interesting to say, maybe. If it's not something I've already talked about before, because sometimes some vampires are the same as other vampires, and if I've already talked about one kind of vampires, I can't review a different property that uses vampires the same way without repeating myself, and that's just not interesting to me. Chat jumped on me again. I'm sorry. I'm trying to find where I left it. Well, someone says they need to watch Vampire Night when they finish watching Penny Dreadful. Penny Dreadful. Oh, what a disappointment the vampires were. I did like parts of that show. The vampires were not a part of that show I liked, especially not Dracula. I was going to make a video about like my top 10 worst Draculas that I hate. The Dracula from Penny Dreadful was going to be in that video. Adam Craig asks, since Dracula played on Victorian technophobia and xenophobia, does the Quick do anything interesting with the modern day versions of either? Not really, because nobody was foreign in this, and there wasn't really much technology in this. There was a train, but the vampires didn't do anything with the train. And I'm guessing the author didn't want to go in that direction because it's already been done, and she wanted to do her own thing, if I had to guess. Lauren Byer says, as a toast addict, I heartily approved of the amount of toast in this book. I'll drink to that. There was a lot of toast in this book and a lot of potatoes. They were always toasting the bread, and they were doing the thing where they had like the spike that you stick this toast on and you stick it in the fire. All they ate was toast, butter, if they were lucky. I was like, these people have such low calorie intake and such simple carbohydrates. They must be so hungry all the time. Oh, this chat is being so buggy tonight. Right, I think I've finally caught up on the chat. I know there are a lot of questions I didn't answer, but I'm trying to stay on topic. Someone asked what book is next for our book club, and that is a very good question because I definitely want to tell you, we have voted, and I asked the book club if they wanted to read Anno Dracula by Kim Newman or The Beautiful, which is a new book that just came out recently, which I've been told is bringing vampires back. Or the book that won the vote was A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness, which, despite having witches in the title, is a vampire book. And if you would like to join my book club and read A Discovery of Witches with us, it happens to be on sale on Kindle for $2.99 right now. I don't know how long it will be on sale. But I will read you the summary, and you can decide if you would like to read A Discovery of Witches with us, or just come back for the next live stream and hear me talk about it when I'm ready to talk about it. Deep in the heart of Oxford Bodleian Library, scholar Diana Bishop requests a manuscript called Ashmole 782 in the course of her research. Coming from an old and distinguished lineage of witches, Diana senses that the ancient book might be bound up with magic, but she herself wants nothing to do with sorcery. And after making a few notes on its curious images, she banishes it quickly back to the stacks. But what she doesn't know is that the old alchemical text has been lost for centuries, and its sudden appearance has set a fantastical underworld stirring. Soon, a distracting horde of demons, witches, and vampires descends upon Bodleian's reading rooms. One of these creatures is Matthew Claremont, an enigmatic and eminent geneticist, practitioner of yoga, and wine connoisseur, and also a vampire with a keen interest in Ashmole 782. Equal parts history and magic, romance and suspense, A Discovery of Witches is a novel of epic scope, traveling from the cobbled streets of Oxford to the chateaus and mountains of the Auvergne to a small town in upstate New York. It also takes us to a rich 1500-year history that spans Clovis and the Crusades, the Knights Templar, and the American Revolution. As Matthew and Diana's alliance deepens into intimacy, Diana must come to terms with age-old taboos and her own family's conflicted history, and she must learn where the modern woman she is meets the source of ancient power that is her legacy. With a scholar's depth and the touch of a great storyteller, Deborah Harkness has woven a tale of passion and obsession, the collision of magic, alchemy, and science, and the closely guarded secrets of an enchanted world. So, they made a TV series out of this book, which I want to watch because one of my followers sent me the TV series in DVD form. Another one of my followers sent me this book along with the sequels and the companion wiki book. So I have them all and I need to read them, and I'm very happy that the club chose this one so I can get on it and read this and then watch that series. And anyone who wants to join or read it with us, come on over to Discord. Link is in the description. Just say when you join the Discord that you want to join the book club so I can make sure to add it to you because it is private. Oh no, is the book back up to $10.99 on Amazon? It was $2.99 this morning. Maybe it will go back on sale, but it's an older book, so you probably have good luck getting it from the library. It is, any book that's older, you usually have better luck. Someone asked if Germans will get a translated version of my book. If you mean The Company of Death, my publisher does not own the translation rights. So if someone, like a publishing company, wanted to translate my book and sell a translated version of my book in another country, that is available. I just would need a contract for that. So if there's a company out there that wanted to do that, it is possible. But for now, The Company of Death is just in English. Yes, there are probably a lot of copies at used bookstores. However, you should not be going out to used bookstores right now. You can check online used bookstores. You can probably get this book for pretty cheap. And if you order enough books, you can get free shipping, which I am always a fan of. Right, does anyone have any more questions or comments about the quick? If we're done talking about the quick, we can move on to talk about other things. Not that I haven't been already, but more other things. Now's your chance. And if the conversation dies down, I will end this live stream and say goodnight. But if it keeps going, I can keep going as long as you can. Yes, my library is closed too, but my library does check out ebooks. And you can check out ebooks from your library or from Overdrive or Hoopla or Libby. Look at all those websites because some of them you just use your regular library card and you can sign it up for. Yes, thank you, Augustus87. Have I read Angel's Blood? I have not. What's the biggest challenge I had as an author? As an author or as a writer? Because the biggest challenge I had as an author was finding a publisher. I tried to find an agent first for my book, but no agents wanted it, which I'm not surprised because a book about zombies and vampires in this day and age is hard to make money off of. So why would they want to buy it? But then finding a publisher, when I went to publishers who took unsolicited manuscripts where you don't have to have an agent, I got a lot of offers, but most of them wanted me to change the book, like make it a romance, make it just from one person's point of view in ways that I didn't think were best for the story. Or the authors or the publishers were kind of weird in some way, like maybe vaguely racist seeming. So finally finding the publisher I did that had the same vision for the book that I did, but better. Like they helped me make the book better. And they were a very progressive publisher. Like they were very supportive of queer rights and trans rights and all kinds of stuff, and doing very well. It was just very good luck finding them. But that was hard. Took me a long time. How is my Spawn and Paul? They're all okay. We're all going a little stir crazy here, cooped up in this house. But they're good. What advice would I give to aspiring vampire authors? Well, think about why you want to write a vampire story. What is it that you think you have to offer vampires as an author that is lacking in the world, that a void that needs to be filled, and try to hone in on that and make that your focus. A lot of problems that first-time authors have is they'll just write a novelization of their D&D campaign or something like that, whatever the vampire equivalent of that is, even if you're not a gamer, but that sort of thing that you have in your conscious, in your psyche that you've done before, to rewrite it to be your book because you think it feels natural. But vampires are always going to mean something. Even if you don't intentionally mean it, they mean something. So figure out why that's important or cool or interesting to you, and just keep that like line going through your book and don't lose track of that line. So that way that through line is there. Can I do a review of Vampire Hunter D? I can. I've watched it. I actually watched it a long time ago, planning to do a review on it, and I didn't have anything interesting to say at the time. I feel like I might now. That might be changed now, but I'm mostly doing reviews that my Patreon patrons request because those are always going to come first. So as long as my Patreon patrons keep requesting me to do reviews, I'm always going to put those first because they're the ones that make my reviews possible. I can't do reviews without Patreon supporting them. So if they stop making requests, then Hunter D might be in line, but not in the near future, probably. Do I write from an outline? I absolutely do. I can write a like 30,000 word outline, and that will just roll out of me. I can write that so fast, and I get all the details down, and I can shape the whole novel, and it's got the structure, everything's there. The hard part for me is turning that outline into prose that sounds good, because writing is hard. What do publishers actually do? Well, a publisher will take your manuscript and make it the best it can possibly be with you through the editorial process. You get developmental editing, line editing, copy editing, proofreading. Then they will format your book, design a cover for your book, make your book into a physical thing, and then they'll take it places and sell it for you. my publisher travels to cons. Before the virus happened, they were going to a con every other weekend with my book on a table at cons, selling it in addition to their website and online, promoting it, marketing it, reach that I could not reach if I self-published. How different do you think vampires need to be from humans to be proper vampires? Physically, psychically, or psychologically? No, physically or psychologically. Sorry, it's hard to read this. I don't think they need to be a certain level of different. I think circumstance can matter a lot. Yes, having vampires are very different from humans is really interesting. But if you have a vampire that's like, oh, they're practically human, how are they even a vampire? Well, the fact that they have to hurt people to survive makes them a vampire. And there are vampires that don't have to do that, but maybe have something else going on. Whatever that difference is enough. They don't have to be any certain level of different. There are no rules to vampires. All vampires are valid. Oh, someone asked if the Quick had good character descriptions. Um, I felt like they were perfectly serviceable. I didn't feel they were lacking. I wouldn't say they were very excessive descriptions, but they were good. I feel like the characters came out through their actions a lot more than the descriptions. The book did have kind of spare descriptions sometimes. What do you all think? Did the book have good character descriptions? What's the ETA on the second book? Do you mean my second book, The Company of Death 2? It was supposed to be this year, but with all that's going on, it's definitely not going to be soon this year. We'll see. But the publisher is backed up. Is backed up. Even if it came out tomorrow, it would be bad for the book because people wouldn't be able to buy it. So I think later in the year is better for it anyway. I don't have a date yet. As soon as I do, I will let everyone know. Prince Crazy asks, who is the greatest vampire? Well, obviously it's Lestat from Interview with the Vampire, because he's my favorite, and my favorite must be the greatest. And if you don't think so, you should go watch the video that Dom made, because I helped him write it today about the vampire Lestat. I should link that. Let me find you that link now, because I am obsessed with Lestat. And you should all be too. I'm going to link you to that right now, just because I worked with him on this video and it was a lot of fun and he did a great job. So you should go watch his channel and watch his videos. There, it's in the chat. He promoted me today, so I'm promoting him. Go watch his videos if you haven't yet. Just realized I'm wearing skeleton hands for earrings. Yes, thank you. I love these. And a bat necklace and my Haunted Mansion onesie. By the way, how in detail does character description have to be? As little or as much as you want. Different readers like different amounts. So if you put too much, some readers won't like it. If you don't put enough, other readers won't like it. You do what's right for you, and you will find your audience, and your audience will love you for what you write because they are your audience. Who's my second favorite vampire? Right, because Lestat was an obvious answer. Oh, that's hard. I'm gonna have to think about that. I just love all my vampire children. Someone says, as long as vampires drink blood, that's about the only rule. I mean, not even. There are energy vampires. As long as they have like one of those vampires things, it doesn't have to be a certain thing. Like maybe they could just be immortal, but don't have to drink blood, but they're still immortal, undead, whatever. They got to have a vampire thing going on. But there's no rules to vampires because vampires aren't real. Have I watched Forever Night? No, I have not. I do have a Patreon patron that keeps saying they plan to request me to do it at some point. So I'm hoping that will happen at some point because I've heard things. Someone asked, should you start reading Interview with the Vampire? Start with Lestat. You should start with Interview with the Vampire. You should read all the books in order. Don't read them out of order. Why don't I like Armand? Oh my goodness. Why don't I like Armand? I love Armand. Armand is bae. I like to give Armand shit. For those of you who don't know, Armand is a character from Interview with the Vampire in the Vampire Lestat, and he's an antagonist character. He's kind of Lestat's great nemesis for a while. They're frenemies eventually. I love Armand. I don't dislike Armand. I just like to give him shit because it's part of the fun. Part of the fun of being a Lestat fan is giving Armand shit. It goes with the territory. But you got to love him to be able to do that. You got to appreciate their relationship. If I could ever write a relationship of vampires that's as complex and interesting as Lestat and Armand's relationship, I would die a happy author. That's one thing that I've strived to all my life, and why I've written a lot of fanfic. What do I think about the trope that vampires can't control themselves around humans? I hate it because humans don't become rabid and they were once humans. Well, if that's what makes vampires different from humans, I think it's valid. If you hate that trope, fine by you. There are plenty of other vampire tropes you can have. I think that is a very popular vampire trope because you know how werewolves are popular because a lot of people relate to the fact that you have this monster inside of you that sometimes you could just lose control. And if this monster got out, you could just you wouldn't even know what you were doing and you can't control it. And it's sort of freeing to let that beast out and to just know you have no control, but it's also horrifying at the same time. That kind of vampire who's like, oh, scent of blood, I can't control myself, I must leap on you and bite you, is that same kind of exploration of monstrousness. And some people like it, some people don't. That's fine. I like it when vampires have trouble controlling themselves, because I think if it was easy for them, it wouldn't be interesting. If I've missed any of your questions or comments, feel free to post them again. It's hard for me to keep up with the chat because it keeps jumping around on me. If I just keep not answering your question, that's probably because my answer is either no or I don't know. Please don't be offended. I don't want this to be boring by just saying no and I don't know. Have I seen the What We Do in the Shadows TV show yet? Might be heresy, but I actually liked it more than the movie. I have not seen the TV show yet because I do not have cable. and it is not streaming anywhere that I have access to. I suppose I could pay for it and buy it and watch it, but I have not done that yet. What are my thoughts on some of Anne Rice's new books? A librarian that I know told me specifically to never read past the first 3 books since it goes downhill. It does go downhill, but I still love them. They're still fun. The thing about those books is the first 3 books are literary fiction. It's a genre. It's a type. It's supernatural, horror, fantasy literary fiction, but it's literary. That's just the way it's written. After that, the books start gradually becoming urban fantasy. It's a different genre. A lot of people think urban fantasy is trashier. There's a big split between literary snobs and genre snobs, even though it's genre literary. But the genre changed, writing style changed. There's still a lot of that elements of that sister reads. It's funner, it's more adventure focused, it's more plot focused, it's much less meandering thoughts of philosophy and theology. So if you really like that literary aspect of the first 3 books, you're not going to like the later books. But if you just like the characters and want to see what they do, you might be interested in the later books of Anne Rice's series. The problem is some of the things the characters do aren't things that you would expect those characters to do. So it feels out of character, but her characters, her baby, she can do what she wants. There are only 2 books that I haven't read, which are Blackwood Farm and Blood Canticles, so I can't speak to those. Those are supposed to be the worst. In the new books, the whole aliens from outer space, lost city of Atlantis, birthing the vampires thing was really weird, but I could see where it was going. So, it depends if you like pulpy genre urban fantasy fiction, because it's right in line with that. I love how this book club chat has turned into club. Is probably gone by now anyway. But I love live streaming. And, the plague is upon us, so I might as well keep going. Is there a vampire character I don't like / find of little interest in Anne Rice's books? And what do you think about them, the alien origin story? Well, I just mentioned the alien origin story, but if there's a character I don't like in Anne Rice's books, it's Daniel. He is so boring to me. I have no interest in him whatsoever. I don't get why he is so beloved. I don't get it. I don't get Daniel. Never liked him. Oh my goodness, this chat keeps jumping around on me. What if Disney does the Phantom of the Opera? They never would. They never would. Ever read any Brian Lumley Necroscope books? I read the first one about 15 years ago, so I have very vague recollections. I'd like to get it again. I borrowed it from a friend back then, but I can't find a paperback copy anywhere. I don't want an ebook because I've already read it. I just want that paperback copy to put on my vampire bookshelves, but I can't find it anywhere. It's just lost to the ages. Yes, Daniel is the guy who interviews Louis. Do I still talk to Nella and Lindsay? Absolutely. They're my best friends. I work for Lindsay. I moderate Lindsay's YouTube channel. If you don't watch Lindsay Ellis's YouTube channel, you should, because I work on that and it's important to me. She pays for all my health insurance. Any comment that's left on her channel, I read and moderate. There were 4,000 today from her newest video, which was just a shit post, and that was my day. Another reason why it's hard for me to write, because I work for Lindsay. I have 3 jobs, so got a lot on my plate. If I streamed with Lindsay, what would I stream about? I could probably talk her into it if we had something interesting to discuss. How is moderating the Cats video compared to moderating the Game of Thrones ones? Wow, we're way off topic here, but let me tell you, because this is my life. I spend my life in these comment sections moderating them. Cats wasn't bad. Mostly people just being like, oh, it's horrifying. But Game of Thrones had a lot of discourse about feminism, and that can get really sticky to moderate. There's a lot of people that are, bad faith trolls arguing about the women's. That was rough. I'll give you my thoughts on Lestat, the musical. Okay. So Lestat, the musical, was playing in New York back when I lived there. And by the time I found out about it, because I was in a rough part of my life, it was already closing and they were on the last tickets. And Lindsay had already seen it. So she's like, you got to come with me to see it. They're selling tickets. They're practically giving tickets away. So let's go see it. But see it drunk, because this is a musical you got to see drunk. So we got a bunch of Mike's Hard Lemonade because we were like children and that's all you drank when you were 26. And we went to go see Lestat the musical. And I wish I hadn't drank because I would remember it better. But I remember being that obnoxious person sitting next to Lindsay, like, that's not how it happens in the book. And she's like, shut up, I don't care. Listen to Gabrielle sing about the Crimson Kiss. It was, I laughed a lot, and not because the musical wanted me to. I feel like I was kind of mean towards it, but Lestat the musical. I need to watch it again. There's bootlegs on YouTube I can watch again. After working with Dom on his Queen of the Damned project, where he's reviewing the Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned, and the Queen of the Damned movie, comparing all that to Lestat the musical, I'm like, hey, Lestat the musical kind of was a lot more accurate. It got a lot more right going on. Should have given it more credit. Just catching up. I've not seen American Horror Story Hotel. I have it. It's on my list. It's one of those things that, as soon as my Patreon requests run out, I want to watch it because I've heard good things. All right, I think I am all caught up. You're asking my thoughts on Lindsay's Phantom video, the one about the Persian? I worked with her on it. We work together on her videos. I am on her team. All right. I have been going for an hour and 49 minutes now. I want to say, please join my Discord server. You can ask me questions there. I will talk to you about things there. If I don't answer your question, it's because the answer is no or I don't know. I am a person who reads every single comment and every single question, but chooses not to answer them all, because if I did, I would be overwhelmed and you've got to give me some space. But I do read them all. And the Discord server link is in the description. If you want to join the Vampire Book Club and read the books with us, or just watch us talk about the books, even if you're not going to read it, because we do talk about them on the Discord server, you can do that too. Just when you join the Discord server, be sure you say, I would like to join the Vampire Book Club in some way, shape, or form, and I will add you to that. We are reading A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness, about a witch and a vampire having, sounds like a Da Vinci Code adventure of some kind, or National Treasure. They're going on some kind of historical romp. And then after I read this, I'm definitely watching the show, and then maybe I'll review it properly on my channel. But I will do another stream like this about the book with you. And my goal that I would like to do for the book club is, once I have some members that sort of keep coming back and keep being part of it and are interested, I could bring them on the stream with me and we could have more of a conversation between the members of the book, or maybe I'll just pick like 1 or 2 members each time, whoever is available and that's been very active on the Discord channel and actually seems like someone that would be good to have on a stream, or someone that maybe I know personally. I have a few friends on my channel. I don't know if you're here now. If you are, hello, thank you. Soon on Vampire Reviews, though I should probably give it a different name, I will be reading you a vampire story. That's what I'm doing in April. Go watch the Dom's video about the vampire Lestat, because I worked with him on that. Go watch all of Lindsay's videos on her channel, because I work with her on those. And I will be live streaming again next. So I will see you all soon. Thank you all so much for coming. I like answering questions, so if you want to ask me questions on Discord, go for it. Until then, next time, if I get enough questions, maybe I'll do another Q&A, because I love doing those too. But until then, thank you for coming. I'm sorry the lighting is bad. I know it's on me and fitting, but I think next time I'm going to bring another spotlight down here and try to make it better for you. But thank you. Until next time, good night.